I am Professor Dynamat, joined once again with the one and only Aaron Katz, and we're going to be doing part 2 on our discussion on music theory.
Indeed.
Welcome back.
Thank you. So should I kind of summarize very briefly where we went last time and then move on from there?
Sure, perfect.
So we sort of talked about the problems with tuning systems, the kinds of sonorities they were trying to get, and the things that they were trying to do with tuning systems that conflicted with that. The basic idea is that strings that vibrate in an integer relationship to each other, so in other words, two strings vibrating in a relationship of 2 over 1, like an octave, or 3 over 2, like a fifth, or 4 over 3, like a fourth. If you play these at the same time, you get a consonant.
Like the 110 for A.
Exactly, like 110 for A with a 210 for another A. Those sound nice together. And if you do the more complex multiplications, if you have 3 to 2, whatever the base frequency may be, you'll get a nice fifth. Dum da da dum. That's a fifth. and if you play that fifth, those notes simultaneously, you get a sonority. You get a consonant. They sound nice together. Now, I didn't really get into this much last time, but there's kind of a phenomenon where if you're almost at that ratio, it also sounds not so bad. You'll get a little bit of chorusing, right? And for the most part, that's actually kind of nice, you know? Once you get past the sort of nice chorusing level of detune, then it starts to sound kind of off, right? Now, in the equal-tempered system, which was kind of the grand compromise that gives you no pure intervals at all except for the octave, the fifths are very close. So the fifth...
Almost right there.
Yeah, the fifths and the fourths are 2 cents off. A cent is a 1/100th of a half step. So it's a very small interval. Hardly even perceptible unless the notes are played simultaneously. If they were melodic, you probably wouldn't hear the difference between an equal-tempered fifth and a just fifth. The just is what we say for the pure intervals. And tunings that use those pure intervals are called just tuning systems. But as we saw last time, if you tune your keyboard so some of the intervals are just, others may be completely out of tune. So what was happening in classical music in the 1600s going into the 1700s is... What was happening in classical music from the 1600s going into the 1700s is the music was getting more chromatic. That means the notes in between the main 7 notes were being used more and more importantly, they were modulating to more and more distant keys. Now, with old tuning systems, mean tone tuning, just tuning, that doesn't work very well. Once you get to the distant key, then your thirds are completely out of tune. So what they really did with equal temperament is they said, can I curse or no?
Try and keep it as low as you can.
Okay, so they said, I'll just do it mild. So to hell with the thirds. We're just going to have the major thirds, the minor thirds. They're going to be extremely out of tune. And the fifths are going to be close enough where we're going to be able to go to lots of different keys. So that's the system that we are mostly familiar with today.
So it's close, but not all the way.
Right, and the thirds aren't close at all. The thirds are completely out of tune. And we're just used to that. It turns out that your perception of consonants is as much cultural as it is physical. So, but there are those, some who quite vociferously think that we've been all but deceived. And a big...
Tricked by it.
Yeah, exactly. Oh, sorry. And so a figure that would really have gone this way, who intended to rant about this state of affairs, was a composer called Harry Partch. And he devised his own tuning systems and built his own instruments that were tuned to these systems. He considered equal temperament to, at its root, to be a conspiracy of piano builders in the 1800s. That was the final, nail in the hammer against pure tuning systems. And he wouldn't use them, So some composers have gone in this direction. A big one is Ben Johnston. He has lots of compositions that use pure intervals. Now, how do you get these pure intervals? Well, either you need to build your own instruments, or you need to use instruments that can play any note, like string instruments, right? they have no frets. So Ben Johnston wrote a lot of string quartets with pure intervals. So if you want to hear what these sound like, you can listen to music like that. Now, there's a lot of stuff about classical musicians that went in this direction that's broadly considered to be experimental, although it's actually become, if anything, more common in recent years. Wendy Carlos is one that did a lot of stuff with alternate tuning systems. You want to go back over 100 years, Charles Ives experimented with quarter tone tuning systems where it's almost a worse solution. Instead of 12 to the octave, now you have 24 to the octave. And there's an interesting composer called Vishnegradsky who built a quarter tone piano. It has 12 extra notes on it that are just like the regular keyboard, but it's just up from the piano keyboard, and there's where you get your in-between notes. And he wrote a whole bunch of preludes based on quarter tone systems. But what I find equally interesting, if not more so, are the places that pure intervals, most especially pure intervals, survive in the more, quote, ordinary, non-classical art music that we hear. So first of all, to stay a little bit in classical, one phenomenon that you have is string quartets, especially ones that play a lot for many, many years and are really in tune with each other. They will often, either instinctually or on purpose, tune their intervals more purely. And they can get away with this, so, if they go to a distant key, it doesn't matter that they're in a distant key, they just adjust the thirds accordingly, right?
Because it's a stringed instrument, so they can tune it to whatever.
No frets, So if they have a sensitive enough ear and enough skill, they can and do accomplish things like this. To get away from classical, another place where you might hear pure intervals, you may have wondered why the bluegrass harmonies sound so pristine. Well, it's because a lot of the times they're not using equal tempered intervals. They're using pure intervals. Now, bluegrass is tricky because it has to exist in the same tonal universe with fretted instruments, which can't do this, or at least not easily, right? So the degree to which they do this, has to be adjusted for the reality of the instruments they're playing with. But sometimes bluegrass bands, the Stanley Brothers love to do this, and Ralph Stanley does this, they'll go a cappella, and then they're free to tune their intervals. Now, I don't know the degree to which they're conscious of this, but they are doing it. So let me go into one area where performers have become conscious of this, which is barbershop quartets. Now, barbershop quartets originate in the late 1800s. A lot of them were performed by barbershops, with a way to get customers in, And in the 30s, people who were a bit more technically minded were starting to codify what they heard happening in barbershop music and made societies and started publishing newsletters. And what they noticed is that when the barbershop quartet sang 7 chords, so that would be a chord like C, E, G, B flat, that's your typical 7 chord, he noticed that they were tuning the intervals in those chords pure. So in terms of harmonics, well, I'm not going to do it in terms of harmonics. So the E is pure in relation to the C, the G is a pure fifth in relation to the C, but it's also a pure minor third in relation to the E, and then the B flat to the G is what we call the septimal minor third. That's the weird thing you get into.
Septimal, like a seventh.
Like a seventh, exactly, like a seventh. And so there's 2 minor thirds. There's the minor third between, in a major chord, there's 2 minor thirds. There's the minor chord in between the E and the G, and there's the minor chord between the G and the B flat. Now on a fretted instrument or keyboard instrument, that's the same interval. In the harmonic series, the vibrations of the string, those are different intervals. And one of them, let me see if I can get the numbers right. So 4/3 is the 4th 5/4. Oh, one is 5/4 and the other is 6/5. The integer. Maybe off by 1 rate, but I think that's about what it is. And so what happens is if you tune the 4 voices in a barbershop quartet to these intervals, you get this really consonant, beautiful sound. And since they're a cappella, they're not limited by the instruments that can't do this, right?
No friends.
And so that's what's interesting is that barbershop quartets were already doing this. But they probably didn't know what they were doing, right? By the 30s, barbershop quartet societies had, honed in on this and defined it. And so now this is a defined element of barbershop quartets today. They understand that they're tuning their voices to these pure intervals, right? Now, another example that I find kind of fascinating, this is another situation where the guy doing it probably didn't know what he was doing, but other players realized. And this is Eddie Van Halen. Now, one of the problems in hard rock music or metal, where your guitars are, high gain, heavily distorted, lots of effects, is you start hearing minor differences in the intervals very strongly, because there's so many harmonics in those strings when they're distorted like that, it becomes annoying. So what they do a lot of the time, your fourths may be equal tempered, your fifths may be equal tempered, but like I said, they're very close. So that's not bad. And what metal guitarists and hard rock guitarists often do is they eliminate the third. And the reason they're doing that is because it sounds terrible, So a lot of times they're just chunking along on the bottom 2, 3 strings. They're just getting rid of the problem with the third. Well, what Eddie Van Halen did is he tuned his B string slightly flat to pure. So if he plays between the G string and the B string and does the major third, that's not an equal temper major third. It's a real pure third. Now, apparently, other guitarists who noticed he was doing this, I think, like Jeff Beck or others were like, hey, that's a really interesting approach there. Apparently, he didn't know what he was doing. He just used his ear, and it just sounded good to me,
Because these pure intervals are going to sound great to the ear.
Exactly right. If you have as sensitive an ear as a musician like Eddie Van Halen does, he's just like, yeah, there's the sweet spot, right? But what this does, it allows you to play major thirds in hard rock chords, which usually don't work. Like I said, they usually avoid the thirds because they don't sound that good. But
so they'll stick with it. Wow. So is that drop D?
No, that's not drop D. That's another tuning. This is, I don't know what you call this tuning. I've only really heard it referred to as the Eddie Van Halen tuning. And basically it's a normal guitar tuning, except the B's tuned to a pure third in relation to the G rather than an equal tempered third in relation to the G, which is what most guitarists do. And this allows you to do big bar chords and hard rock chords that have a third in them but don't sound crappy.
That's so cool. Who would have guessed?
So
I didn't know we were going to go from Pythagorean to Van Halen, but here we are. This is awesome.
Yeah, there you go. So another place where you're likely to hear pure intervals is in groups made up entirely of brass instruments. Well, no saxophones. They're not really brass. It has to be, trumpets, horns, trombones, tubas. Now, brass instruments make their main notes by playing harmonics of a fundamental. So these are the same notes that you get on a guitar if you touch it at the 2-to-1 and a 3-to-1, 4-to-1. Brass players get those same harmonics just by changing their embouchure, right? Now if they don't touch their valves at all, they've only got one length of tube, and the only notes they can get are the ones that fall in that harmonic series. The characteristic of the harmonic series is that the lower harmonics are very wide. Like the first harmonic is an octave away, next one's a fifth away. As you get into the higher harmonics, you can start playing scales along a single length of tube, right? But those intervals are going to be pure intervals, not equal tempered intervals. So what brass players do when they play with other instruments that can't do this is, first of all, they now have 7 lengths of tube. Right? And along each of those 7 lengths, they've got all the harmonics. And that's how they play the notes. Have you ever played a brass instrument? Or?
Trumpet.
Trumpet. Okay, so you know how this works, right?
No.
Well, intuitively, you do know how it works. So, but I'm sure you've noticed that on trumpet, certain notes don't quite fall on the right notes. And then you've got a little valve that will adjust the tube length so that you can sound more equal tempered. Right?
Oh, okay. That's why we did those adjustments.
That's why you did those adjustments. But if you're in a brass band, you don't necessarily have to do those adjustments because there's no equal tempered instruments that you have to play in a chord with. And most brass bands will do that. They'll find these pure intervals, and that's why some people believe that brass bands sound out of tune, because they're used to hearing equal temperament, and they think that the brass band is out of tune. They're actually in tune. So,
That's so funny.
yeah.
That's awesome. Okay, so our brain just naturally hears what's going to be pure and identifies it as pure.
Well, that's an interesting question, isn't it? Does our brain naturally hear what's going to be pure? You can certainly make an argument that there's a natural, physically grounded sonority in pure intervals, right? And that tended to be what musicians were going for before equal temperament came along. But equal temperament and even well temperament, which was the kind of, you could see it as a precursor perhaps, where they would temper some of the intervals, but not all of them. These have reprogrammed our brain and what we think counts as a sonority. So since we're all used to hearing the equal temper thirds, they don't bother us. Unless you're Harry Parch, who had a sensitive ear and knew the history, and they bothered him no end, you know? And if you took a musician from 1600 and plopped them down, you know, even a century and a half later and had him listen, he would have thought everything sounded completely out of tune. So it seems clear that culture and expectation plays a huge role in what we think sounds good. And most of us have all but bypassed any response to pure intervals. But if you play trumpet, you're going to be interacting directly with pure intervals. It's just part of the nature of the instrument, because pure intervals are part of physics, you know. And I'd say in the big picture, culture plays the stronger role than the physics. So, yeah.
Well, the tools will shape what you create.
Exactly, yeah.
Well, that's so awesome. Well, I really appreciate you bringing more information on music theory, which is, I've learned so much. I've learned so much. And from the comments that we've gotten, and thank you to everybody who's been commenting, it seems like people are really enjoying what you're dropping. So thank you so much, Aaron. I really appreciate it.
Well, thank you.